And now I want to prepare you for our speakers today. We have two great speakers, scholars, facilitators, innovators, initiators, advocates. Dr. Patrick B. Reyes is the Director of Strategic Partnerships for Doctoral Initiatives at the Forum for Theological Exploration. He's a Latino practical theologian, educator, administrator, and institutional strategist. At FTE, he supports scholars of color and works with institutional leaders on a number of inclusive excellence initiatives. His expertise is helping communities, organizations, and individuals excavate their stories to create strategies and practices that promote their thriving. He is also the author of a book called Nobody Cries When We Die: God, Community, and Surviving to Adulthood. With him is Dr. Dori Baker. She is a senior fellow for research and learning at the Forum for Theological Exploration, which is an Atlanta-based leadership incubator for the church and academy. Her research lies at the intersection of young adult culture, innovative leadership, cultural studies of race and gender, and spiritual practices that sustain activism. She wrote Doing Girlfriend Theology, God Talk with Young Women, along with several other books. She is also the series editor of Chalice Press imprint, highlighting diverse, faith-based leaders of social change. Like I said, she is the author of numerous books and journal articles, and she is also a United Methodist clergywoman who facilitates interfaith gatherings of women and is also active in movements for racial justice in the Virginia Annual Conference. Both Patrick Reyes and Dr. Dori Baker come from Forum for Theological Exploration, and I was a beneficiary as a doctoral fellow and a dissertation fellow of their work, so I'm extremely supportive of the good work they have put their hands to. Would you join me in welcoming our guests tonight?
All right, joy in the aftermath of violence, that's the topic. This photo you have up here comes from my home community in Salinas in the aftermath of gang violence. So this is not an abstract topic for me. I feel this in my bones and in my flesh. It's where my work got started. So I'm wondering if we can start with just a moment of silence for us to think about the young people that we work with, the communities that we come from, and the violence we're experiencing. So we're going to take about 2 minutes to just center down, get comfortable into the space, and remember that there's actual lives, faces, people behind our topic and our time together. Is that cool? Let's take about 2 minutes to just center down, get comfortable, take a moment to breathe. So for the next hour or so, I hope you hold that name, that face that you're carrying with you. Dori.
So thank you for helping us begin with sensing the sacred stories and the lives lost and the personal history of the violence that are with us in this room.
of our continuously unfolding vocations. And we invite you tonight into a conversation. We want this space to be conversational, so speak back to us with or without invitation. Let us know when we touch a nerve. Give us your feedback. Let us know that you are alive in our audience, okay? So my work in religious education brought me into deep awareness of the power of story in the lives, particularly of women. Mujerista, Asian feminist, and womanist, and white feminist is where I ground that's my home in theology. The ways in which those groups of women have voiced their pain, their violence, and have found God in the midst of their daily lives and their daily struggles. And my work, particularly with women, has brought me into intimate awareness of the constant specter of violence confronting girls and women, and the ways, sadly, that the church often colludes to mask or hide or even contribute to this violence. But at its best, I believe, Christian community can function as a healing space, which provides for individual lives to return to joy in the aftermath of violence. Moreover, and this is the heart of where we're going tonight, the Christian story compels us to lead in ways that disrupt structures and systems of violence. The Christian story compels us to create beloved community and contribute to a future, a public future, where all can flourish and experience the joy for which we were created.
So I'm Patrick Reyes. I direct the Doctoral Initiatives, as Sarah said, at the Forum for Theological Exploration. I carry on the legacy work of many ancestors, but just to name a few, since 1968, we have been offering a critical intervention into the violence in the academy against scholars of color. So in 1968, we started this fellowship program. Benjamin E. Mays and Charles Shelby Rooks got together, and they're looking over at the field, and they see only 40 African-American PhD holders in the field of religion and 18 students. And so they said, we need to do something about this. So we've been carrying that legacy forward. So in the 2000s, Sharon Watson Fluker came through, built a bigger network. My predecessor, Matthew Wesley Williams, who still works at FTE as a VP, and now me, trying to carry this legacy of offering a critical intervention into the violence of a violent system in the academy against scholars of color. But that's not where I come into this work. So I come from a small agricultural town that's riddled by gang violence. So I come into this topic of violence after hearing the cries of my community, my family members, myself, embodying those cries and those wounds, and thinking about what are the conditions that we are creating as a community to build the capacity for joy. So that's how I got into this work. And I just want to say this lecture is designed, this facilitation, is designed by practitioners first, that we really see our work as intervening in systems. So we're going to be doing some systems work here. And I just want to acknowledge for a moment that violence in the aftermath, joy in the aftermath of violence makes for really, really crappy after dinner conversation.
Especially on a Friday night.
Especially on a Friday night at the end of a week. So I apologize for that, and I'm sorry. But we're going to do some unconventional stuff here. So if it's cool, we're going to settle down, we're going to do some tough work, and I hope that you stay with us throughout our time.
So we're going to do two things. This is where we're going over the next little while. We're going to paint a picture of violence as it inhibits joy in the lives of young people. We're going to do that through some statistics, but mostly we're going to do that through stories. And we know that each of you hold your own stories of your community where you have interacted with violence, and there will be some time to delve into those and think about them through the lens of a system approach. So we are also going to propose a curriculum, but it's not a curriculum that comes on paper, and it's not a curriculum that's going to be confined within the walls of a Sunday school program or youth group ministry, because we are going to propose a curriculum of disruption, a curriculum that focuses our leadership around disrupting violence and making a way for joy in and through the structures and systems that we inhabit. So that's where we're going, and hopefully it'll get clearer to you as we continue to walk with you.
And so let me start with what we're not up to, although it's very necessary. We're not going to be taking you through a bunch of activities or best practices for pastoral care as an intervention into violent events. That work is necessary and absolutely has to happen in every single moment of violence, but that's not really what we are up to. We're really talking about the system of the church and the capacity we're building collectively to intervene when violence happens. But I suppose we better start by what we mean by violence. So I put up here just violence is overwhelming. You can see here the number of ways that we could build taxonomy around violence, sexual violence, physical violence, psychological violence. The list goes on and on and on. So to focus down on any one of these would take up a full 2 hours. So let me get a little broader in the definition. The World Health Organization defines violence as the intentional use of physical force or power, threatened or actual, against oneself, another person, or against a group or community, which either results in or has a high likelihood of resulting in injury, death, psychological harm, maldevelopment, or deprivation. Expand this definition through a theological lens, scholar and religious educator Mayan Tran defines violence as, quote, a distortion of the sacred vitality and intimacy of bodies, of communities and social structures, and of earthly habitats. So in these terms, violence ranges, on the one hand, from localized examples of particular bodies experiencing harm. I open this up with, I feel it in my flesh and in my bones. On the other extreme, violence involves the systemic ways bodies experience harm as a result of structural injustices, such as generational poverty and racism. And I'm just going to provide a little quick statistical thing to get us into the room and to think about violence and how overwhelming it is. Department of Justice found that more than 60% of children were exposed to violence within the last year. Not surprisingly, the report found that these children suffer from depression, anxiety, post-traumatic stress disorders, fail or have difficulty in school, and become delinquent and engage in criminal behavior. Sexual violence is rampant in our culture. The Rape, Abuse, Incest National Network reports 1 of 8 girls and 1 of 53 boys experience sexual abuse under the age of 18. The perpetrators of these acts against children and young adults are known to the victims, 44% being acquaintances, 29% being intimate partners, 27% are family. Homicide is the second leading cause of death among young people 15 to 24. Homicides were the leading cause of death for African Americans, 10 to 24, and the second leading cause for Latinos. 1 in 3 young people have been in a physical fight within the last 12 months, and 17% report carrying a weapon. National Science Foundation found that school rampages take place in stable, close-knit, low-crime, and very small rural towns. The shooter is generally white, adolescent, and male. In high-poverty neighborhoods, often plagued by illicit drugs and gun markets, they're particularly at risk for at-risk youth. Urban bloodshed, which often unfolds between known antagonists, is far more ubiquitous and hence extracts a terrible toll on families and communities, destabilizing the local communities. And this is just to kind of give you a sense of how overwhelming this is, and that the young people are in your congregations, they're in your schools.
So Patrick and I, as we got our assignment and began to delve into this topic, already well acquainted with it, experienced our own sense of being overwhelmed with the weight of and the heaviness and the enormity of violence as it affects young people. And we were a bit caught off guard by that, and also experienced a new recruitment to care more deeply than we had been already. And I want to check in with all of you all, just given this brief walkthrough of these statistics. Are you feeling it? Are you thinking, you seeing names and faces? And having some memories, and having some even triggering emotions around times when your lives have been interrupted by violence, when your ministries have been interrupted by violence. So I want to just acknowledge that and hold it and sit with it for just a minute so we don't gloss over it. And I'm going to move now from the stories that statistics tell to we are each going to tell a story of our own interaction with violence. So I am sitting in my office with Danny, a 21-year-old woman who is now ready to tell her mother the truth of the past 7 years. We hold a space for her story to unfold. At the age of 14, Danny was raped by an older friend who then boasted about the encounter across his social networks. He adjusted facts to portray Danny as willing and desirous of future hookups, which became the source of a whirlwind of rumors that came to define her. As Danny relates the details of the following years, especially the experiences of hiding the true facts to protect herself from further scorn, her mother watches, honoring her daughter's story with silence, tears running down her face. As a friend of Danny's mother, I witnessed those years. We saw a lively, curious, athletic, and academically gifted girl go underground. In the 8th grade, Danny was a star student, but by 9th grade, a teacher described her as sitting in class like a zombie, eyes unfocused and completely absent. She lost interest in her passions, went through extended periods of silence during which she would avoid all human contact, alternating with angry outbursts and tearfulness. Occasionally, her engaging former self would surface, but most of the time she walked through her days a slim shadow of the girl she had once been. Back in my office, Danny tells us that she often cried herself to sleep night after night, unable to imagine a way out of her pain. Tears were the wallpaper of her life, and her mother shares that Danny's tears became so commonplace that they were the sad new norm. Danny's parents sought counseling and eventually turned to medication for anxiety and depression as a means of simply keeping her alive. They supported her desire to change schools. In a new school, Danny found a new group of friends and eventually rebounded, returning to her former passions and finding new ones. She graduated and moved away from home for college. So during all those years, Danny's family never knew the source of their daughter's diminishment. In this small zone of safety that is my office, Danny names the violence she experienced and the ongoing trauma it causes. She avoids visiting the neighborhood where she grew up. She distances herself from childhood friends and does not keep a Facebook page, all for fear of revisiting the trauma associated with her adolescent shame. During college, she became an advocate for women experiencing sexual abuse and began to heal some of the memories that scar 1/3 of her life. She carries a deep wound that surfaces unexpectedly around self-image, social interactions, sexuality, and other portions of her life. And she acknowledges that these will take the rest of her life to continue healing.
So I woke up after remaining asleep for about 18 hours. I'm 16 years old, and I wake up in the bed, and I'm covered in my own urine. I wake up, I'm the oldest of 5, so I'm not supposed to pee the bed when I'm 16. I start collecting my sheets, gathering them. I'm running downstairs to go try to throw them away before anyone else wakes up. And, it was like 11 o'clock in the morning, so everyone was already awake. But I was trying to get through. My dad catches me in the hallway, and he says, he sees me, and he goes, what do you have there? And I said, nothing. And he grabs the sheets from me. He sees I'm wearing, and he goes, are you okay? I said, I really don't know. I ran back up to my room thinking, what's wrong with me? At 16 years old, I was pimply faced with braces, just trying to date girls and have a good time. It didn't really make a lot of sense why I'd wake up covered in my own urine. Reflecting back, it makes a lot more sense. Not too prior to that moment, I had seen a little girl get shot right in front of me at the neighborhood park. I had suffered domestic violence at the hands of, when my parents divorced, at the boyfriend of my mother, who nearly choked me out and nearly killed me. So at 16, when I'm peeing myself, it totally makes sense now, looking back. But this is the type of violence and trauma that I hold in my body. And as I reflect back years later, when I think of what is that question, what is wrong with me, I just wanted to be normal, or have some semblance of normal. I think Howard Thurman says it best. You might have heard this quote earlier in the week. But he says, fear is one of the persistent hounds of hell that dog the footsteps of the poor, the dispossessed, and the disinherited. Fears of many kinds. Fear of objects, fear of people, fear of the future, fear of nature, fear of the unknown, fear of old age, of disease, and fear of life itself. Then there's the fear which has to do with aspects of experience and detailed states of mind. Violence causes those fears for me. Trauma experts such as Judith Herman and James Gilligan, in the findings and recommendations of the DSM-5, remind us that the fear of violence repeating itself creates the cyclical nature of trauma. The violent event repeats itself over and over and over in the memories and can be triggered by similar sights, stories, smells, sounds, textures of the traumatic event, and inhibits a young person's ability to experience joy and an ongoing reproduction of the violent act. This is also known as PTSD. These stories provide just a brief glimpse into the vast wilderness of young people experiencing violence. For so many youth in our communities who suffer from domestic violence, sexual violence, youth-on-youth violence, and multiple other forms of political, social, and racial violence prevalent in our world today, joy is inhibited by the fear of tomorrow not being a reality.
So as Pat said earlier, we both value pastoral care approaches to healing after violence. Both of our work creates zones of hospitality, zones of safety where young people can come together for a period of time, where they can name their wounds and experience moments of liberatory healing. In these kinds of spaces, following a Freirean pedagogy, young people can learn to read their habitat with greater clarity and can imagine inhabiting spaces where sustained periods of freedom and flourishing really are possible. From small beginnings and with the help of supportive community, young people can heal, and beyond healing, they can find what I might call a definition of joy, agency, self-determination, and freedom from the persistent hounds of hell in the aftermath of violence, or what Mayan Tron calls more pointedly the afterburn of violence. In the book Joy and Human Flourishing, Charles Matthews proposes that the ultimate purpose of the church is the cultivation of joy. The church, he writes, is, quote, a form of theopolitical soul crafting and community creation whose ultimate purpose is to enable for its members an embodied, deliberative life that cultivates a hopeful joy that is a foretaste of our eschatological hope. So for Patrick and I, both of us use a liberatory lens. We also then must ask, what is the church's role now in creating a culture in which the experience of joy after violence is a possibility? How can the church now best support people who've experienced violence to thrive, flourish, and experience the joy that is their birthright? So I promise we are going to get into interactive space. This is not a lecture. It's feeling a little like a lecture right now, so I promise we're not going to stay in this space much longer. But I do want to reiterate that the flip side of a theology of joy is sometimes a theology of suffering that appears to justify suffering and violence as a necessary path to deeper joy, and that troubles us. Young people suffering the afterburn of violence are often told by the church that everything happens for a reason. God doesn't give us more than we can handle. Platitudes that actually, in the perception of young people, simmer down to, it must be my fault or God sent this to me. And we want to reject that theology. And Teresa Pasquale says it best for us. The bitterness of acute pain impacting the soul changes us. It doesn't mean we deserved to be hurt because we were divined for this particular kind of ache. It doesn't mean it isn't more than we can handle. It just reminds us that we are creatures born for unimaginable resilience and an unending capacity for hope. And this is probably the most poignant part of the quote for me. She says, we lean into joy with more urgency because we know the density of a guttural and deep lament. So I'm going to say that again. We lean into joy with more urgency because we know the density of a guttural and deep lament. So the magnitude of the violence facing young people today, coupled with the shrinking influence of the church in North American society, requires something more than the creation of small zones of safety and healing. We must acknowledge what liberation theologian Ivan Petrella calls zones of social abandonment, entire swaths of our communities from which society has turned its face. So while the creation of alternative spaces is absolutely essential, we are proposing a bolder curriculum for the church, one in which congregations step out of their comfort zones and adopt a more public role, engaging strategic interventions that support widespread cultural change. And we're going to tell you, we're going to map that out. We're going to let you walk what that might feel like. Following religious educator Maria Harris, we define curriculum broadly as rooted in the Latin verb currere, which means to run. So Harris talks about the curriculum as the course the church is to run. So in everything it does, the church is teaching, and it's preaching the word with words, and it's embodying of the word with words and with hands and feet. In our liturgies, in our teaching, in our community building, in our community with people that look like us, in our community building with people who don't look like us. In everything the church does, it is teaching. Do you hear me? This lays the way for public forms of religious education which extend beyond the walls of our organizations to disrupt violence and create more life-affirming cultures. This rhythm of disruption and creation should feel familiar to us as Christians. The founder of our faith was a young adult spiritual innovator who migrated across the countryside surrounding Jerusalem, recruiting souls to form alternative community, enticing them out of isolation. A brown-skinned man who accompanied those living on the underside of empire, he offered immediate relief of embodied class-based pain, all the while subverting power structures sustained on the backs of the least of these. A primary way Jesus operated was through naming the conditions in which he found himself, connecting isolated individuals to one another, building a larger community of practice, which then extended his ministry beyond his death, and illuminating the world to joy. So those 4 words, that's what we want you to walk away from this place with: naming, connecting, building, and illuminating. These 4 steps come to us. We see them mirrored in the life of Jesus, but they come to us through the work of a scholar by the name of Meg Wheatley and the Berkana Institute. They have this theory of a 2-loop system of living and dying, which is what we're about to walk you through. So these crazy ropes and signs on the floor represent an upper loop, which is red, and a lower loop, which is green. Ignore the yellow tape. That's just an electrical current running through the middle of our map. The basis of this theory is that the greater access a living system has to itself and to its resources, the greater capacity it has to heal, to adapt, and to adjust. And we see this in our own bodies. The more the hand knows what's going on in the foot, the more access we have to our bodies, the more our bodies have the ability to heal and rebound after injury. So we wonder, what if the church is more like an old-growth forest than it is like a collection of policies and polity and policing of tradition? More importantly, what if the church, by claiming its space as one among many systems of power and agency within a violent culture, what if the church could harness energy to name, connect, build, and illuminate those spaces where life-giving healing is already releasing joy in the aftermath of violence? This is the curriculum we're offering. Let us show you what we mean.
So first of all, let me just say, this is the imperfect framework. It's just to give us something to talk about. So as you go through and want to analyze this, that's fine. Blow it up. That's part of the conversation. But you'll notice on the floor we got 2 loops. We got this top loop that's going up here in red. I'm colorblind, so I'm assuming it's red. And then we got this black and green one going down and through. And we're going to kind of walk you through just the overview before we get into the specifics of it. But over here, if we're thinking about the church as a living and dying system, we have the emergence of whatever the new established system of influence is. So this is maybe the church in North America. And it comes and it rises up to here where I have this nice little orange thing says steward, and then I'll tell you what's on the back. But it's rising in power and influence till it's at its peak, where it's hosting something.
So when a system reaches its peak, at the same time, a new system begins forming. We think of these systems as going on multiple systems within a larger and larger ecosystem. So all of these are smaller systems living and dying and living at the same time. This new system is being born, it's finding its way, it's building its energy, and it gathers steam and begins to emerge over here as a new system of influence.
So one of the things on the flip side of this steward resources, when they're up here at the top, is the influence paradox. Because what we know with living and dying systems is that, well, with living systems, that eventually there's a decline, there's a decay. So we start to see that system of influence, the power that it's built up and amassed over time, kind of start to decline. And down here we have basically a hospice. You know, this is the decline of whatever that living thing is to eventual death. And then what we have down here, disintegration and compost, which we'll talk more about.
So what we're going to invite conversation around for the next bit of our time is, how is the church like this living and dying system, and how do we find ourselves in it? It's not a linear map, and it's not a timeline. It's a framework for understanding multiple causes and multiple effects, the ones we live within. So we're going to walk through this loop one more time with more details, and we'll identify significant moments where key leadership practices emerge, and we'll show how, at different places in the system, we can choose to participate in a curriculum of disruption that disrupts violence and creates conditions for joy.
So let's go back over here to the emergence or genesis of the established system. Let's just call it the church in North America, creating institutions that we come to know, many in this room, as big mainline denominations: UMC, ELCA, Presbyterian Church, Episcopal Church, American Baptist Churches, UCC, American Baptist Churches, Disciples of Christ, Quakers, Reformed, and for me, I'm a Catholic, so Catholics are over here. These institutions start to gain in America this power and influence with people and spreading churches. There's, the first UMC of New Haven, second whatever of New Haven, third, you get it. These institutions are flourishing, and we tend to think of them as large, pervasive systems that just happen. Now they're just there. But they actually rise in terms of their power and influence over time. And I just want to pause right here. One of my frustrations with the church and the way I was trained to think about theological education was that this rise was always a good thing, that this rise in systems was always a nonviolent thing, that because we're Christians, we do things right. And as a Catholic, I have to say that's probably just not true. So I think of 1492, this rise of emergent systems. You have the church in Europe expanding its influence across. So you have Spain coming over here, Portugal coming over here. You got Columbus coming over here, all accompanied by the church coming over here, gaining influence and power. One of the things that I always think about is the 21 missions in California. I've taught in 4th grade. Is anyone from California? No? Okay, I guess there we go. 4th grade, we had to make a little mission, and celebrate this rise of influence. So you have this colonial paradigm that's happening. The church is accompanying this. It's getting land, resources, money, gold, and it's rising till eventually gets up here to the top where it's got all of these resources that it now has to steward. To honor my ancestors, I have to say, from most of my family's from Central Valley of California, some from Mexico, and they were always traveling near the base of the Sierras. In order to fuel this rise, they were pulled off their little place in the Central Valley and, forced to work on these mission systems. And one of the stories is that when we go out and look at any of those missions, there's burial grounds out back, and there's a number of my ancestors who are buried there, unmarked graves. And so just recognize this rise to power has a violent underside. But there's, let me tell a nicer story. So, then I think it's resonant because we're here at Yale. So you have this establishment in 1807, Andover Theological School. So the rise of theological education. They're now here, right? So you have them as the first kind of iteration of what is the model of theological education. And it's replicated over the next couple hundred years and spread out and rising to power. This kind of goes in line with the mainline denominations. So you see this kind of rise in mainline. I think the best example is in the 1950s. You see mainline churches at the height of its power. Over 70%, Gallup poll found in the 1950s, identified with the mainline Protestant church. So they're sitting up here. They got seminaries, publishing houses. The pews are full. Suburban churches are blowing up after World War II. But violence, when we choose to see it, is present even here. September 15th, 1963, around 10 a.m., a bomb goes off in 16th Street Baptist Church, killing Cynthia Wesley, Carol Robertson, Addie Mae Collins, and Denise McNair. And let's just pause to consider that this bomb occurs just a few weeks after what many consider the moment the moral conscience was breathed into our society, or at least that's how I was told in history, on August 28, 1963, when the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, and we first heard the I Have a Dream speech. Violence disrupts this system of influence that is the church in the U.S. People start wanting to see another way, perhaps a more just way of being church. The Protestant mainline begins to see folks who walk out of this top loop when it's at the height of its power, and they start going down to what we're calling this name and initiators. And one of the things Dori will get to is some people are already here. And one of those people is Cesar Chavez, who says on my side of the country, in 1968 in Sacramento, he gives a speech called The Mexican American in the Church during his 28-day hunger strike, following 31 months of the Delano Great Boycott, in which my family was a part of. A defining moment for oppressed Latinos in this country. He talks about this move from the top loop to here. He says, quote, "What do we want the church to do? We don't ask for more cathedrals. We don't ask for bigger churches or fine gifts. We ask for its presence with us, beside us, as Christ among us. We ask the church to sacrifice with people for social change, for justice, for love of brother. We don't ask for words, we ask for deeds. We don't ask for paternalism, we ask for servanthood."
So, as Patrick said, at the top part of this system of influence, the leadership task is to steward. And we want to bless this moment. There are good things that happen here. There are necessary things that happen here, right? This is where our friend Matthew Williams says, we want to bless the ushers. We want to bless the board of trustees. We want to bless those who are stewarding this immense weight, this immense bounty of resources on towards perhaps something new. So there's a leadership task here. And the leadership task down here for the initiators is to prototype something new, to try and to fail and to succeed and to experiment. And people who find themselves down here in this initiation, having walked off, sometimes look back up to that old loop and they know well its reward systems, and they can feel disenfranchised down here. They can also have been here. They can also have never had a place up in that system of influence. They never had a place there, and so they can feel lost or abandoned or silenced or unseen, invisible. The other thing that can happen right here is something called the Christopher Columbus syndrome, which is some of us walk out off this top loop and we get here and we think we're the first ones here and we're initiating and we think, oh, we're innovating, we're doing something new. And I liken this to, my good foremothers in the United Methodist Church, first ordained in the 1950s. When I come along into my ministry in the late 1980s, they're building curriculum, they're gathering, they're hosting conferences, they're supporting one another, feeling like they're doing it all for the first time, completely forgetting that in 1843, when New York State emancipated slaves, Sojourner Truth was called by the Spirit and founded Kingston Methodist Church. She initiated, she innovated. So the action of walking out is not new. There were people here before us, whoever we are, when we feel like we're innovating. So what happens right here, pardon me? Question in the back. Yeah.
Was not a slave. She was a woman who was enslaved. And enslaved was her status or her condition. It was not who she was.
Thank you.
I want to pause and I want to thank you for changing the language. Absolutely, and I appreciate that. Thank you. I hear it with love. I hear it with love. Thank you. So, those of us who end up here having walked off of top loops, we model beginner's mind. And we model listening. The leadership task here is to listen and to have a beginner's mind and remember that we don't know it all. And that when voices come to tell us what we don't know, we honor them. So I honor that. Thank you. Thank you. So what happens out here is these innovators and initiators begin to find each other. I am not alone. There is someone else who just had to walk out. There is someone else for who it's not working. And they begin to form exchanges and networks where they share ideas and information and new practices and ways of doing things. And the leadership task right here is to connect people. The leadership task is to see the patterns in our communities where, oh, she's doing this and he's doing that, and they don't know each other, but I see them, and they're about the same thing. I recognize the gospel in what they're doing. So I'm going to have them over for lunch. I'm going to have a meal. I'm going to host an event, and they're going to know each other so that they can connect. The leadership task here is to connect. It's also to connect with a sense of equity. Because the people who survive, the systems that thrive, are the ones that get resources. So paying attention to equity and who's in and who's out and who's not getting connected. Another critical leadership opportunity here is to nurture a different way of relating to one another. Because we can walk out and completely rebuild what we just walked out of, completely mimic the old ways of relating to one another if we're not careful, if we don't come with beginner's mind, if we don't initiate new ways of listening and hearing and being heard. So I want to pause here and give you the first of 3 case studies of organizations that represent places on this map from which to address joy in the aftermath of violence.
I hope we have sound. Let me just start playing and see if we do.
I was abused from age 6 till my late teens.
Several pastors counseled me to stay in a sexually violent marriage.
The men who abused me were well respected in my church.
My wife is an abuse survivor. I've also seen how negatively it affects her when the church does not support her.
One of the most common things asked of abused victims is, why didn't you just leave? I didn't leave because I didn't think I was worth the effort.
Is beginning to heal my heart.
I'm safe now and using my gifts to train pastors about helping abuse victims.
And how healing it is when the church shows true love and action.
We cannot be neutral toward the issue of abuse, for to be silent is to stand with the abusers.
I'm doing the hard work of healing from past abuse.
Church, where victims are believed and cared for.
Loving the hurting like Jesus.
On the front lines of abuse prevention.
Healing together.
A place where Christ's love is spoken over all.
A place to heal.
Where leaders are equipped.
Church, where children can just be kids.
A community of love and support. We can't just sit on the sidelines. We can be the hands and feet of Jesus.
A place where voices and boundaries are heard.
Committed to standing with the victims.
Church, where all are safe.
So this movement is under a year old. Ashley Easter, a 22-year-old woman, walked out of the church community that had raised her and groomed her, and in which a pattern of sexual abuse was not just tolerated, it was supported. Just a year ago, she walked out. She held the first conference of people in her community who were similarly experiencing abuse within the homeschool movement, the church-supported homeschool movement, and 140 people showed up at her conference because they had been experiencing the same thing. She spoke out. It's a lonely place to be, right? So Ashley is now, the Courage Conference is now down here in this place of naming what they're doing as different. We're doing church different. We're relating to sexuality, patriarchy, and the violence that came with it differently. We're defining gender roles differently for her very conservative segment of the church in North America. This is a disruptive work. So given this living and dying system that we're naming here, we wonder, so how do you enter in? How do we enter in when we experience something like this in our communities? We attend to the work that disrupts. We look for the gospel in what these new organizations that are springing up are doing. We connect them to the work that we know that's been going on in other denominations and other places for decades. Marie Fortune's good work, the good work that's been going on in the healing around clergy sexual abuse in the Catholic communities. We connect people to this disruptive work. We connect this disruptive work to people with larger and larger networks from which it might gain valuable learnings and resources. We host the connections in ways that allow us to leverage the social capital of the Christian community toward ongoing disruption of violence. The other option, friends, is to continue with business as usual, which would be to condone the ongoing violence.
So I left us last up here at the top of our power and our height. And so we start to see this decline, and anyone who wants to argue that let's say the mainline denominations aren't in decline, Gallup just said we're at 50%. So we were at 70% in the 50s, now we're down here at the 50s. Decline is happening, but it's not really decline. Transformation's happening. We're still 70% a Christian country, but it is changing. Things are changing. So another way to think about this downward loop is not so much as a decline as in towards death, but a change, a transformation's happening. So we get down here into this decline or transformation, and the work here is really of hospice. I'll give a story about this. I was working at a small Christian liberal arts college, affiliated with one of those mainline denominations, an assistant dean for academic affairs, and a young woman of color comes into my office. She knows my story, she knows where I came from, and she sits down in the chair, she starts crying, and says, Dr. Reyes, one of my good friends from high school passed away. He was killed. So we sit there, I'm sitting in my office, having a deep pastoral care moment with her. We're sharing stories, tears, hugging. We're there for several hours. I said that pastoral care still absolutely needs to happen when violence interrupts the lives of young people. So we had that moment here. But I also said I promised we'd go beyond pastoral care. What she didn't know was just the previous weekend I had been sitting with the board of that college, talking about whether or not this college was going to remain open. So you have this young woman of color, promised great grades, first in her family to go to college. She's a success story in her community who has violence interrupting her narrative. And the institution that she has put her faith and her future is going to fail her. And so I have to sit with that in this decline, in this hospice, no one had paid attention to the leadership challenge of hospice. They didn't steward their resources well. They had a big sprawling campus that they shut down. They opened up an inner city campus. They went from next to no diversity to over 50% students of color. But what they did down here was they tried to reimagine that same educational model that led to their decline up here. They looked back and would say things like, if we just had more mission fit students, which was code for white middle class students. If we just had X number of donors, just give us more money, we could walk back up this curve and we'd be here, which totally just ignored the conditions in which this young student had found herself in my office. We didn't do hospice well, so we see this decline. That leads to, in this case of the story, death. I'm just wondering, can you raise a hand if you have accompanied someone in death? Just want to hold that. That's a tough space to be in. How about an institution? Has anyone walked with an institution as it died or transformed? It's a tough place to be in. We have a leadership challenge after that moment when this transformation is happening. Disintegration. What do we do with the resources, the lives, the memories of those that have transitioned into this? What do we do down here in this moment? In this institution's case, what do we do with the money when we sell our buildings and lay off our faculty and we no longer have any of this overhead? I think this gets us to our second case study, Homeboy Industries. I'm sure many of you are familiar with Father Greg Boyle, or G, and this book, Tattoos on the Heart. Some of the work they do at Homeboy Industries, but let me just tell you about the genesis of this because they kind of go through this. He's called in the 1980s to work at Dolores Mission Church, a small church in what he called the gang capital of California or the world in Los Angeles. He has crumbling infrastructure. Like most Catholic churches, he's got an aging population, but they want to do something about the violence they're experiencing in their communities. Start education programs, a work program, all these things. And he has a man by the name of, let me see if I can get it here. Ray Stark. He's a widower, former Hollywood agent and producer who wanted to put money into G's programs and said, I got all this extra capital after this, after I'm thinking about what my legacy is going to be. And Father Greg could have done what most pastors would do, help me fix a window, fix the roof. We want to keep hosting folks. And instead he says, why don't we buy the recently closed bakery across the street, get a tortilla machine, and start what then eventually became Homeboy Industries in the late 1980s. So he's down here thinking about how do we take these resources after this large decline. Do I go back and try to push myself all the way back up and support my church? Or do I listen to the cries of my community who are suffering from gang violence and actually listen and do something differently with those resources? So he gets down here into this next space.
So when a centuries-old tree dies in an old-growth forest, it falls to the ground and becomes a nurse log. Maybe you've seen them on your hikes in the Pacific Northwest. All of the nutrients stored in its being decompose and disintegrate and become new microecologies for the emergence of new life. Shoots spring up and are nourished by the condensed gifts of the generations that came before it. This living and dying system, it's the rhythm of God's created order, life into death into new life, a continuous cycle. And we liken it to some organizations we see where 501(c)(3)s, nonprofits, have sprung up in underserved neighborhoods, and they're doing the work of composting. They're doing the work of transitioning resources from dying congregations, buildings, locations, people, money, into new, thriving ministries. And then after a while, the people will start to say, and we need a community to celebrate our victories with, and we need a community to mourn our losses with. And so we're not kissing goodbye the baptizing, the communing, the confessing, the confirming, the marrying, all of the beautiful sacraments that this system of influence gave us. It's going to spring back forth up. We're going to keep forming Christians, and they're going to keep forming communities in which what we have, the good things that we have to offer around guiding communities through the transition in their lives are available and ready. And that's what happens down here. So the networks of support are loose exchanges of information, sharing of ideas, but they begin to build what we call communities of practice. Communities of practice care for something more than just themselves. They're beginning to establish ways of being, practices of being community together that inform everything they do and that spill over to affect their surrounding communities. In a healthy system, these nutrients become available down here to new generations of living systems. A key leadership capacity here, what church pastors and youth ministers need to know how to do, is to draw attention to those needs beyond the group to develop that shared identity. It's a time of embodying and making real the ideas that have been swirling around. And then what happens is all of a sudden, These communities of practice begin to form an emerging system of influence.
This is one of my favorite parts. So what we see here is Peter says in the fifth discipline, innovation has taken place up there. We know it's innovation because it's not just a good idea anymore, but it's an idea that's scaled and been replicated. And everyone wants to get on board. It's a thing. And one of the easiest ways to see this is in technology. I think it happens a little bit faster. So if you have a smartphone, can you just go ahead and hold it up in the air? I'm serious. Everyone hold it up in the air. That smartphone, or the iPhone, for example, was only introduced in 2007. 10 years. So they introduced this. I mean, if you have a Samsung, you want to hold it up. We say that technology and church don't go together. Samsung made that one that lights on fire. That's a Pentecost technology. So anyways, we got the smartphone. We walk over here. Everyone's here participating. I got a cell phone. I'm waving it around. This is now a thing.
You didn't have to build it.
No.
You didn't have to design the app. You just walked on over.
Yes.
So that's the way this theory works, that systems of influence build. It's not a matter of convincing everyone that I have a better way and come on over and do it exactly like mine. This idea of translocal learning is that we've shared our ways, we've adopted to different contexts. So it's a very contextual thing that happens when we begin to see the emergence of a new system. So here we are, we bless the whole. We bless it all. It's all important. We're going to notice places for dialogue, and we're going to break down the false dichotomy that what's been established has been established and what's emerging is emerging. We're going to notice that many of us stand on many different places of this framework simultaneously. So our last case study will show how communities of practice begin to influence new systems. Freedom schools.
Currently, we're at Camp Affaball for minors, 13 to 16 years old. They're all here for different reasons. We have home invasions, aggravated assault, attempted murder, even sometimes rape.
In the position that I'm in right now, you don't find that too many people care. A lot of people see you more as a number instead of as a person.
A lot of these minors, a lot of their parents grew up in the system and they stay in the system.
But when I first got here, I looked at myself like, the school was kind of boring. I was getting restructured, suspended too many times.
I noticed a lot of racial tension, a lot of gang tension.
This is our first time implementing the Children's Defense Fund Freedom Schools in a probation camp sitting here in California.
Probation has never seen a program like this before. In the last 8 years that I've been here, we've had a lot of programs that we tried to run, and the kids just weren't interested. It didn't grab their attention enough. But this particular program grabs their attention.
When Freedom School came, it's just like it changed. I became a better man. It helped me in my reading. It helped me with some good words. I even know some big words.
So as a camp, every morning for 30 minutes, we pull together and we cheer and we chant and we celebrate reading.
Have fun and learn at the same time.
Children come in all the colors of the earth and sky and sea. The end.
Helped me with my anger, because I had anger before I got here. Now it's kind of calmed down because they help me. Freedom School help me. When you get mad, they say, hey, you let me do your dance. Yeah, so it's kind of fun.
When I say freedom, y'all say school. Freedom school, freedom school. Hip, 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 hip.
But then Freedom School came, and then I've been staying out of trouble. It's inspired me to stay in school, not to get kicked out every day. So now I stay in school, study, and then I know what I'm catching up to where I'm supposed to be.
When you get up, it's not always to go steal, go smoke. You can get up, sing good morning, tell your mom good morning or something, go to school, get an education, read. Now I love reading books. At first I didn't like it. Now I love it.
There's a program that should be another camp. It would inspire more kids to do good, give them a reason why to be good. If we get distracted or we need some free time, we just grab a book and we'll be on the free time with the books.
Long run, we just trying to develop good people and smart minds.
So it feels good to know that someone cares, that someone wants to help you do better in life.
Reading is power, knowledge is power. So we're trying to empower them as well as motivate and inspire them to be better people.
joyful feeling.
They're happy. And I don't think I've seen that before in the 2 years that I've been here, that happiness and that joy.
Everybody to make it to week 5. So strong. Something inside so strong.
I'm so blessed to have been a part of it. I'm thankful that they piloted at this camp, and I cannot imagine that we will not be doing this next year across all the camps because it makes such a difference.
You'll see a smile on my face a lot more. You see me in a better mood throughout the day. And as far as long-term goes, you'll see me, well, I'm not sure, I can't promise you anything, but I want you guys to see me go to college, to finish high school, and to do something positive with my life.
Do I hear an amen? Amen. So over the last 22 years, 137,000 kids, K through 12, have experienced this culturally sensitive, holistic curriculum inspired by the 1956 Freedom Summer, the alternative education that happened in between the spaces of lobbying for a Voting Rights Act. So the beautiful benefit of this program is the young people get to experience coming alive to learning, and the young adult servant leaders, who are leaders already in the community, college-age people, get trained and become a community of practice among themselves. So that we see the Freedom Schools as beginning to influence. They're caring about more than themselves. They're not just, this was not a fundraising promotional video. They're not raising funds for themselves. They gather each summer all the practitioners together to think about how are we influencing policy in our neighborhoods? What are the other models and ways to disrupt the cradle to prison pipeline? That's the way they measure their impact. So when these communities of influence, these communities of practice begin building a new system of influence, the leadership task here, what can we do as pastors, as youth ministers? We illuminate the good work that is already going on. We identify it and we shine a light on it so others can see it, adapt it, adopt it, play with it, contextualize it, and find ways of making it their own. So what we're going to do now, finally, feels like it's a lot of words for me and Patrick, to be thrown out here. What we're going to do now is invite you to come out and walk this map, to walk this framework. And we're going to ask you to do it with, how many of you have walked a labyrinth? So a labyrinth is a journey, it's a pilgrimage that you walk with an open mind and an open heart, open to what you're feeling, to your emotions, to your emotional state, what you're feeling in your body. We're going to ask you to come out and walk around on here and hold both the stories of violence that we've shared and the stories of violence that you know by heart because you've been living them, and the stories you are holding about the church in hard places. And we're going to ask you to try out different locations. Stand here and wonder, are you an innovator? Stand here and feel what it feels like to be stewarding an institution that may be past its zenith, maybe experiencing transformation. Find where you most belong and then just hang out there for a minute. Are you hospicing a dying institution? Find a place that calls out to you, particularly as it relates to the violence that we've been talking about. Where do you find yourself in relationship to violence with the communities and the organizations and the institutions where you lead? So take a deep breath and then just start walking. It'll be a little chaotic, a lot of bodies moving, but it's been an hour since dinner, so it'll be good to move. So come on out.
All right, so for those who are sitting, if you could stand as you're able and try to find somewhere on the map, I'll give you a little heads up of where we're going. Once everyone's kind of located on this system, think about where you are in your institutional life and your leadership capacity, because we're going to do some conversation about where you find yourself on this living and dying system. Let's take another 2 minutes to kind of find and get settled. All right, we're going to go through a quick few dialogue prompts. So turn to 2 or 3 people who are in your near proximity. Smile awkwardly if you're like me. Like, why am I looking at you in the eyes? Here's what I want you to do. Here's your first prompt. For the next 5 minutes, I want you to introduce yourself And each person take about 90 seconds to say who you are and why you're finding yourself located at this particular spot on the map. Give them some context around the institution you're serving in, where your ministry's at, maybe where the larger congregation is, but just talk about why you find yourself where you are on the map. Are we clear? Cool, take some time to do that. So before I get to the second question, I want to remind us that we, don't worry, you'll have a chance to go back to the first one. You haven't finished the first one. That we said this was going to be a difficult topic. It was violence as an inhibitor of joy, or violence in the, joy in the aftermath of violence. So we want to get to that part. So second prompt, I'm going to give it to you. I'm going to give you some prompts too to kind of help you think about things, but this is what the second question will be. Share a story or two about how you've led in the aftermath of violence, or think about a moment when violence has interrupted you where you are on this map. And how did you respond as a leader in the congregation, organization, institution, or ministry you're leading? And I just want to kind of set this up a little bit. I want us to think broadly about this in terms of the moments in our community, whether it's a loss of a young person, addressing current events like world terrorism, conflicts and humanitarian crisis, such as what's happening in Syria, or the violence that ended the lives of Eric Garner, Michael Brown, Alton Sterling, and Sandra Bland. Where were you when almost a year ago, Philandro Castile was pulled over and killed? Or when Pulse nightclub was under attack? For my community, I'm getting all choked up here, it was around this time in 2014 that an 11-year-old Guatemalan boy was found dead, died of a heat stroke after trying to cross the border, wandering the desert after being disconnected from his family. He was only identifiable by the phone number written onto his belt. This year marks the 25th anniversary of the riots in Los Angeles following the police beating of Rodney King. Things like 9/11, school shootings in Columbine, in Salinas in my hometown in 2010 that wasn't covered nationally, Newtown, or the countless violences that often happen behind closed door, intimate partner violence, clergy abuse, etc. The things that show up when youth show up in your office, they are bearing the marks of violence. How does your community respond to these or other instances of violence? How do you respond as a leader? So again, the prompt here is share a story or two about how you've led in the aftermath of violence, or think about a moment when violence has interrupted you where you are. How did you respond as a leader of the congregation, organization, institution, or ministry? Take some time to do that. All right, last question. All right, before I give you the last question, I want to lift up the hood a little bit and talk a little bit about the pedagogical practice here, is that we really believe that when the body has access to itself, it can make the transformation. So I want you to look around. This is the church in its various forms and ministries. And we honestly believe that when you talk to each other, you are all the experts. We're not trying to be the smartest in the room here. We are trying to build a very, very smart room who can address joy in the aftermath of violence. So that's a little bit about the pedagogy that you see here, doing this system. So, since we are the church, and I want you to just hang out with the folks you are finding yourself on this map, maybe there's another place on this map that you're really curious about. Maybe you are up there stewarding resources and you really want to be a namer initiator, or you're at the beginning of an established influence and you want to go over there and be playing with the iPhone when I was playing over there in that new system of influence, or you're composting and you want to be back over here at naming. You want to actually start something new. So I want you to make eye contact with someone across the room. Make eye contact, turn around, look at each other, and go and talk to them. So move in the map, find someone else, somewhere else, and move. All right, here's your final prompt. Are you ready for the question? All right, this is the question. How are you creating joy in the aftermath of violence from wherever you first found yourself? Tell someone where you were in that first iteration, and how are you creating joy in the aftermath of violence from your institutional location? Is that a clear question? Yes? Yes-ish? Yes. How are you creating joy in the aftermath of violence from wherever you found yourself first on this map? Tell that new person that. Cool? All right, do that.
We are at 8:30 on a Friday night. It's been a long week. Do I hear an amen? Yeah, some of you have been learning together here all week, and we have led you through a very complex system of living and dying and being the church and being present with young people in the violence that affects their lives. And we want to leave you with sort of a vision of this curriculum and what it would look like in action. And we know that you know that now because you've just consulted all these other experts in the room. And so I want to hear back from you what you heard. We gave you 3 case studies. We told you about the Courage Conference that's over here initiating new ways of being church within a certain aspect of the Christian community that has not yet addressed patriarchy, but now is, naming the way it shapes people around gender and sexuality and creates unhospitable environments, unsafe environments. We looked at Homeboy Industries and the way it was composting a dying tradition, but allowing those resources to transfer over and give life to folks who had been inside and now were flourishing because they had a job and a sense of meaning and purpose and a reason to get up in the morning, joy in the aftermath of violence. We talked about freedom schools over here and how they're building these communities of practice which have the potential to create a new system of influence. And I want to pause here and note that this word emergence is deeply spiritual. It's not that we've convinced people to come on over. It's that something is bubbling up from among us that resembles the gospel, that resembles good news. And people can see it, and they come on over because there's no denying that it holds life, joy in the aftermath of violence. That's what we saw in the freedom schools. So I'm curious now, I'm going to ask Pat to hand around his mic. I'd like to hear examples of maybe ways that you're illuminating, or maybe ways that you're naming, or maybe ways that you're connecting, or maybe ways that you're building. That's the 4 steps of this curriculum. Naming, connecting, building, and illuminating. What did you hear from each other? It might be a story you told, or a story someone told you, as long as it's not a story that's deeply personal, but a story about one way in which they're interacting with this system and being part of this curriculum of disrupting violence. Tell us your name first, please.
Michelle Blacksmith, and my husband would like me to say Tompkins. But I've been Michelle Blacksmith for 47 years before I was Tompkins. And thank you, Dr. Baker, for, like the kind of prompt, because it made me think about the language of violence and the violence of language, and I was perfectly prepared to tell my own story about a violence occurring in my family this week during a memorial service where there should have been no violence and where none of us is raised that way. And the person from whom the violence came was totally unexpected, and it was really disruptive. And I really wanted to talk about it in the family. Then I wanted to talk about it here, but it's not my story to tell. So now that I put that out there, when they hear that, they'll know. They'll know. But this piece about how you get to joy through violence, I'll just give you my personal, I happened upon it by accident, but I practice it fervently, maybe not consistently, but I really try. And that is to name the thing. I've learned over and over again just in my life that the times in which I felt most oppressed, or I felt like someone was trying to box me in a corner or co-sign something that I knew was wrong, and especially in a family where you grew up with this big, sprawling African-American family that has a Southern kind of sensibility, married with a Yankee tradition. We've been here in this area of Milford, Stratford, Bridgeport, at least to the late 1700s. On my mother's side, we don't know what the African or Southern connection is. We can only guess that it's there, right? And so with all of that, we're a loving family, a cultural family. My grandmother, mother, father, everybody, we always talked about just who we are as a people, and not knowing where on the continent, but that wasn't important. The fact is you could look at us and see we're from the continent. Something happened to get us here. And so that kind of recognition that whenever I don't say exactly who I am in a space where somebody has misnamed me, or I allow someone to define someone else in a way that is not true. And Dr. Baker, you were using a language that, in the early 90s, scholars started fighting really hard to replace terms like slave narrative with emancipatory narrative for a very reason. And it wasn't about making people feel good about, oh, you're emancipated and not a slave. It was because slave narrative on the very face of it is a lie. It's really hard to have a slave narrative exist because once you are able to write a narrative, tell a narrative, either physically or literally or figuratively, you are free. The vast majority of people who are responsible for the things that we call formerly slave narratives that are now recognized as emancipatory narratives either purchased their freedom, were agencies of their freedom by some kind of subterfuge or escape, and that could be anything from a woman dressing like a man to a husband and wife dressing like master and servant because the husband is dark and the wife is light, and people just assume that or women who were ingenious enough to know that, number one, the clothes that they had made over time, that they had to sew them into their garments and construct something that looked like a hoop skirt, but it was all the clothes that they'd ever possessed. And yeah, women, have a certain sense of vanity. I know I do. I want one more dress. But the realization of it is that if you go to look at the wanted posters, people are described mostly by how they dress and how they act. And when I look at someone like a Harriet Jacobs, who for years, until Dr. Yellen here at Yale, said that Linda Brent isn't a fictitious character. Her name is Harriet Jacobs, and Harriet Jacobs could read and write, and she really did write incidents in the life of a slave girl. She had to publish it under Linda Brent because there was a wanted poster for her, and the description said that she was something like, and I know you can look this up because it's there in the record, she is like comely, portly, fair of face, and likes to dress in finery. And she's not slick, clever or something to that effect, and deceitful. And I don't know anybody who could go and pick somebody out of a lineup because they're clever, deceitful, portly, comely, and they have nice clothes. And so you get an idea for the psyche of the person who is looking to get his property back because he's been robbed. You see, she robbed him when she stayed in a place 7 years and watched her children from a space of a 6x9 little hole and watched her children play with the grandmother, and they never knew the woman was alive. And then eventually, after she escapes because she wears a kind of clothing that's only meant for sailors, she gets up north, she purchases the freedom of her children, she sits down, she writes a beautiful story, but this is the part that it really sticks with me. It's important that the story is written. I give a lot of credit for the woman by the last name of Childs, who was really a staunch supporter of Harriet Jacobs and made sure that not only did she get monetary compensation, but that the abolitionist movement, particularly for women who were under the hand of such violence, that was a primary concern for Ms. Childs. But
I'm going to pause you for just a minute, and I'm just going to turn the conversation just back to the room because I think there might be other stories in the room.
Of course, yes.
So thank you for, and I hold the experience, and I hold those stories, and thank you for sharing. But I want to know, because we're almost out of time, if there are other voices in the room that want to enter into this conversation about where they found themselves on this cycle, where they found themselves in the curriculum of disruption, or found themselves in the curriculum of ignoring the violence around them. That's also a possibility of something we discovered tonight. Any others want to share?
I think you risk being ostracized too when you identify and call out. You risk being ostracized, and sometimes you do have to leave even when you identify and speak out, and that's a problem. That's hurtful.
Yeah, I mean, that's the position of these initiators out here, feeling isolated and alone. And what do they need? They need to find others when they speak out, others who are aligned with them or who can give them support and tell them you're not crazy for experiencing it the way you are experiencing it. I heard during the conversations as I was eavesdropping around you all, the prevalence of the fear that our children are living with. Fear of school violence. They've been having intruder drills their entire lives. What is the church's response to that? How do we address it? In all that we do, we are teaching, in our preaching, in the way we build community. Remember what I said with those who look like us and those who do not look like us. In the way we preach the word, with our words and with our hands and our feet. How are we teaching a curriculum of disruption of violence? So we're going to bring it on home. We're going to close it up and let you all go home to all those families that you have left behind. And we appreciate your time and your attention tonight. We want to end with a story from Patrick's life and a story about the importance of ritual in the possibility of joy in the aftermath. Yes?
Yeah, the artist.
Yes.
Can you tell us about that?
Sarah.
I will gladly say this artist is my husband. But it's just part of the worship, was part of the worship experience. So thank you.
And I bet your husband has a name.
Ronnie Farmer.
Thank you. Yes.
I was hearing in the room that there are some communities that experience very little violence, and some people were saying, like, I'm really distanced from tonight. Like, I'd like to know more, I'd like to understand more, but I come from a really privileged community. And then other people's stories that were like, violence is so much a part of the young people's lives that I'm in the community I'm a part of, that it's just kind of like, oh yeah, someone got shot again. Like, oh yeah, like of course we have to walk through radar detectors, we have to walk through detectors to go into school or into any building. Of course another person got shot by police, So I'm wondering about just how we kind of in this very room have these very privileged communities and then these communities that are experiencing so much violence. And what are our plans, our thoughts for like bridging, learning from each other, seeing each other, those sorts of things. Anyone in the room, Sarah, Skip, you all.
That's a really excellent question, and I appreciate the naming of the differences of experience or different points of entry around violence. It's something Pat and I have talked about a lot because I did not grow up in a community like his. Yeah.
One of the things that's very important to do is cross-cultural missions. Is taking youth taking youth out of that culture, first training them before you bring them out of that culture in areas of cultural sensitivity that's dealing with the group, that's dealing with the hosting community. One thing that I do with my youth is allow them to do a demographic study of the community that we're going to, and also to eat the food. They will have to prepare the food that's in that culture. They have to learn the different signage in that culture. So it gives them cultural familiarity even before they go. And that breaks down a lot of barriers when you can understand the language somewhat, when you can understand some of the cultural values that lie beneath the surface. And it gives them, that takes about a year to do, to train them before they go, and it become a part of their project. Even for the seniors in high school, that becomes a part of their senior project. So it's cross-cultural learning that's needed. Thank you.
I'm curious, Dr. Redmond, where on this cycle of violence would you put that very task? Communities of practice, communities of practice. It takes a year to learn how to do this well. We're going to take our time. We're going to learn from other people who've done it before us. We're going to break the cycle of violence that mission was. Did I see a hand over there? Yeah.
I guess the first thing we need to do is the church itself needs to accept these youth into the church. Because like in a case like with me and my family, when we bring our youth into a church, we get resistance. They're like, why are you bringing this gangbanger? They give them dirty looks, and they make it very hard for a kid to join the youth ministry. So before we can even cross these cultural lines, the churches within the community need to open the doors to the youth, For example, in my case, we want to do a youth church. And the only reason I want to do a youth church is because the youth don't want to go to church. Because they don't feel like they connected to the church. So we figure if we give them their own space, we could do that. But the issue is, there's no one that wants to open the doors for that. So what we run into, all the red tape. So I think the first thing we need to do is the church itself, needs to open their hearts, open the doors.
Thank you. And where I would put that on the map is right down here. You are naming that it is not working for us. We have walked out. We're trying something new. We need to be connected to other people who are doing something new, who are prototyping youth church. How did it succeed? How did it fail? And how do we connect you to others so that you can learn from them? And as my friend Rashad pointed out, sometimes it's not other youth ministers. Sometimes it's the aldermen we need to be connected to. Sometimes churches are territorial and they might not want to work with us. So we go where we see the gospel being lived out, and we live it out there with them. Sometimes we name it, and sometimes we walk it with our hands and our feet, right? So thank you for engaging with us. I wish we had more time to keep hearing the examples, because they are in this room. This living and dying human system is in this room. But we're going to close now with a story from Pat.
So thank you for this. This is just a reminder of what we were doing, the Naming, Connecting, Building, Illuminate. I put that up on the board. So one of my entry points into this namespace is I was in Southern California doing some gang intervention prevention work, and we were hosting folks who were young adults who had experienced some form of gang violence or were affiliated with it, had seen people who had stories such as mine, and were really trying to heal themselves after this violent experience. We were hosting these conversations where people were coming together and just trying to tell their narratives. So we're in this new space, trying to find a church that would host us, which didn't really happen. Even though I was a member of a thriving Catholic church, I just wanted the building to be open so we hosted space. We went to nonprofits to help us host. They wouldn't do it. So we just ended up meeting outdoors. And one of the things that we did was we just created the conditions for joy to arrive, which was, we were talking about over in this table, was just holding that space where there can be silence until a story emerges, where someone feels comfortable and safe enough to say, I experienced this, and I need to heal. So anyways, we've been meeting for a couple months. One of our members was shot and killed. Hit our community hard, but like most communities like the one I come from, where you go to get buried is the church. So we host a funeral at the local Catholic church. Priest didn't know who we were, didn't know who the kids were. So we're in the middle of the funeral mass, and he's kind of droning on as usual, just kind of, it might as well have just been some nameless person that was sitting in that we were trying to remember. And so he's up there doing that steward thing. And I remember sitting up in the front row. So imagine this is the front rows, and somewhere up here there's a baptismal candle that's lit to kind of remember this young person's life. And as the funeral mass is coming, one of the elders in our community who was holding space for us in these outdoor things kind of busts in the back doors in the middle of the funeral mass, walks straight up to this baptismal candle and takes it down. Now the priest, who had no idea where he was on this map, had no idea where he was in institutional life, just froze. He didn't know what to do. He basically turned the space over to someone who had been in this space of naming and doing work with the community. So the elder takes down the candle, And he looks at all of us young men who are crying in the front row and says, Mira, look, this is what we are about to do. In our culture, we believe that a death, dying a good death, you probably heard this from Greg Ellison earlier, but dying a good death matters. How we care for the ones that we love in death and experience those death, they carry that energy and that spirit to wherever they're going next. And what I want to do is, as we remember this young person, I'm going to blow out this candle, and this smoke is going to represent their lives. So any traumas, experiences, stories, the pain you're feeling, I want you to breathe it into this smoke and let it rise, because we need to let this soul go. We need to let the trauma, the violence that he experienced in his body go, because it will haunt us in our community, because we have work to do. And so we stood there, and he stared at all of us, and I remember like sitting there thinking like, what the heck is happening? And he said, are you ready? We're going to do this. And he blew that candle out, and the smoke rose. And I remember just watching all my fears, not even necessarily tied to the young person that we had lost in our community, the experiences I had as a young person, all the space that we had tried to create in that community going up in smoke with this, all this negative, violent energy, the retribution we wanted to feel, the anger I felt towards the church, the anger I was feeling towards this priest who didn't even know who we were, was going up in smoke because we had work to do. When we talk about creating the capacity for joy, that's what we were doing, breathing into that smoke. Just the spirit of making a space for joy. And that's really what we're up to. This framework, I know it's not perfect, but we were just trying to give a way for us to see ourselves as church wherever we are, whether we're deeply connected into the violence like I was at the time, trying to create space, naming, or we're trying to connect with those who are doing it, or building new systems and illuminating the ones that already exist. But the important thing is, in the creating joy in the aftermath of violence, it really is about naming what your capacities are to even be there and be present when violence interrupts our systems. So that's going to close our time. I'm going to turn it over to Sarah.